Hello, this is History Literacy Ready, Unit 1, Lesson 8, Identifying Historical Claims and Evidence. In this lesson, students are going to identify both explicit and implicit claims made by historians in a chapter, a PowerPoint, and a PBS Special about the freedom rides. And then they're going to compare and contrast information from the chapter, the PowerPoint, and the PBS Special, and they're going to add to the timeline. And they're also going to add to discipline-specific vocabulary. Now, students have discussed claims before. They may still be unclear about what they are or how to identify them in writing. This lesson is going to provide an opportunity for you to reinforce that concept. So as they read the chapter excerpt and the PowerPoint, they're going to get reintroduced to the concept of claim and evidence and of comparison contrast or corroboration across sources. In this lesson, students are going to watch a documentary. Now, a documentary is a specific genre, and historians often use them and often are part of them as they share their interpretations of the past. In this documentary, the documentarian collects evidence from historians. In other words, he has them testify about the experience. He uses eyewitnesses, photographs, and some video to make the point that the Freedom Rides represented a significant turning point in the civil rights movement, and then it had this effect largely because of the tactics used and the courage shown by those young activists that are highlighted in the PBS Special about the freedom rides. The documentarian, the PowerPoint, and the historians are all making claims about the relative involvement of the president, the Attorney General, and Martin Luther King, among others. The first activity is an orientation to the task, and students are merely to write down 3 observations about the freedom rides from their prior knowledge, if they have such knowledge. They can reflect on the evidence they would need to support those observations. So you're going to have them think about it, write down 3 observations, and discuss what those observations are. You might then get them to think about, well, okay, so if this is my claim, for instance, the Freedom Riders were brave, then what would I need, what kind of evidence would I need to show that bravery? Claim evidence and reasons for tying claim and evidence together are the building blocks of argumentation. So when you're talking about this, as well as in other lessons that you've dealt with claim and evidence, you're really dealing with argumentation. It's important to use that language then, the language of claim and evidence and reasons for the claim. You might even want to think about using the term warrant. Some people do. Be sure to read the information about argument that is on page 110 before you start this unit with students. So activity 2 is identifying a claim made by Farraker, that's in the text, about Kennedy's needing to be forced to become involved in civil rights. So there is a statement, and they're reading a section about that, and they're going through the section to identify evidence for the claim. Then they're going to try to identify evidence for another claim, and this claim is also from the Farraker text, that the Freedom Riders reinforced white resistance. The relevant evidence for the first claim is provided for you on page 111 of the Teacher's Guide. So you can take a look at the kinds of evidence they're drawing in, and you can compare it to the evidence that's on page 111, and you can make adjustments and instruction based upon that. But the second claim really doesn't have very much specific evidence. You can use that. In other words, they're probably going to have trouble finding evidence to back up the claim that the Freedom Riders reinforced white resistance, and you can use that idea that there's not much evidence in the Farraker textbook to support that claim, that sometimes the authors of history texts just make claims and they don't support them with evidence, and that's one of those things that they need to be paying attention to as they read history textbooks. The next thing students do is they are going to be looking at a PowerPoint, and they're going to compare and contrast the PowerPoint with a textbook. So what this activity does is makes the point that what is included in historical accounts do not always agree. So we have these two different accounts, one from a PowerPoint, which came from a university lecturer, and the textbook, which was written by a historian. And you're going to find that there are some places where they don't really agree. So that makes the point that they don't agree, and historians engage in selecting information that they think is relevant, which means that they may be leaving out some information that could be important in supporting an alternate claim. So there are answers about that comparison contrast on page 113 of the teacher's guide, and you can look at students' answers and compare these to the possible answers on page 113. So in activity 3, students are actually going to be watching the PBS Special. What they're going to be doing when they watch this is they're going to take notes and identify claims of evidence in that special. There's plenty of it, so this will give students more practice in doing that kind of identification. You need to know that the PBS Special is long. It's really engaging, but it does take a long time to have students watch the whole thing. I suggest that you have students watch as much as possible, and there are some guidelines for what frames you really need to pay attention to and watch. But if students have access to computers at home, then you can assign the rest for homework if they don't get finished with all of the PBS Special. Reading for claims is different than reading for chronology or facts. So you want to make sure that students understand that it is better to identify the claims and evidence in this particular assignment than it is to get every event in a chronology accurate. Now that's because this assignment is about claims and evidence. It's not about learning everything in the PBS Special. If students are still struggling to identify claims, you can use the ones on page 114, have students supply evidence to support or refute the claims that you're actually giving them. And what that does is it gives you a couple of claims, and they can go through their notes on the PBS Special and tell you what evidence they have to support those claims or not. Group work is really important in this activity because students are going to feed off each other in their identification of claims. Some students are going to find some that others are not going to find, and vice versa. So remember to have clear expectations for working in group activity and for the product and the level of quality. So in activity 4, students are going to be writing an argument paragraph. It's only a paragraph, and that will get them used to writing longer arguments in the future. Working in pairs, they're going to pick a claim and provide at least 3 pieces of evidence for the claim, and then they're going to evaluate the evidence in the claim. Also, students are going to identify the different kinds of evidence that PBS Special uses. There's some discussion of that in the teacher's guide, so you might want to read that first. And then students are going to write a short summary of the argument for which they have identified the claim and evidence. The summary of the argument is actually the argument paragraph. Now, just to help students, there's an example of an argument paragraph that presents claim and evidence, and you want to perhaps walk students through this paragraph, identifying the different elements of that paragraph and how they show up, how the evidence shows up and how the claim shows up. In activities 5 and 6, they go back to the 2 activities they've done in previous lessons, the essential question and the timeline. So what do students do? They add to the essential question graphic organizer from lesson 5. What they're doing is they're taking these new texts, so the textbook, the PBS Special, and the PowerPoint, and they're seeing what they learned from those 3 sources in relation to the essential questions, and they're adding them to the graphic organizer. After that, they're going to be adding to the timeline. Now remember, this can be a class timeline or an individual or group timeline. They're going to have to pick those significant events to add to the timeline that they've been building. So what do you need to know? You could assign the essential questions activity as homework as it was suggested in lesson 7, and that might help you get through the various lessons in your time frame. In activity 7, they are returning to discipline-specific vocabulary that they've learned. Remember that discipline-specific vocabulary is that vocabulary that history uses to talk about history. So they're not history words like places and people and events and treaties and that kind of thing. They are the tools that historians use. So the words that students are going to review are corroboration, claim, evidence, argument, and any other words they've learned previously about historical reading, such as primary, secondary, tertiary sources, sourcing, contextualization, and those kinds of words. What do you need to know? Well, it's important that they can use these terms in understanding as they are applied in history. So you want to make sure that's why through the unit I've asked you to make sure that you're using that terminology so that you can all be speaking the same language about the processes that you use. And that's the end of the explanation of this lesson. I hope it clears up some questions you may have had, and that it helps.